As a result of ceaseless campaigning by organisations such as the NSPCC, the National Children's Home, Dr. Barnado's and the Salvation Army, society began to accept that there must be collective action to lessen ills that the poor, the unfortunate and the downtrodden could not prevent. The early period of almost mass rescue of homeless and destitute children was ending, and public attitudes were beginning to change. But nonetheless, major reforms were very slow in coming, and the dirt, cruelty, neglect, grinding poverty, overcrowding and destitution continued into the 20th century. Thus, the first legislative attempts were made to cut off, at the roots, some of the causes of destitution and to deal with some of the reasons that robbed children of a home life. Amongst the many reforms that Campbell Bannerman's Liberal government introduced was the Education Act of 1906, which provided free school meals for undernourished children, and the Children Act of 1908, which initiated juvenile courts quite separate from the adult courts, and also extended legislation to protect neglected and ill-treated children. For the first time, delinquent children were to receive treatment suited to their needs, rather than punishment for their offences. Between the years 1906 to 1913, the number of children maintained in workhouses fell from 11,000 to 8,000, but the total number of children in care rose from 57,000 to 70,000. In 1909, both the majority and minority reports of the Royal Commission on the Poor Law roundly condemned the practice of keeping children in the workhouse. A member of the Commission reported,
"The children were under the care of a woman who had been there 27 years. She is a fairly capable, roughish sort of woman, hardly fit for such a responsible position. She was reluctant to show anything, and I had to push my way in everywhere. The older ones had all gone out to school, except a cripple and a dreary little girl who sat in a cold room with bare legs and her feet in a pail of water as a cure for broken chilblains. The children, 39 girls and 23 boys, are housed in the workhouse under the care of a male and female industrial trainer. In appearance, the children were dirty, untidy, ill-kept, and almost neglected."
The Royal Commission recommended that effective steps should be taken to secure that the maintenance of children in the workhouse be no longer recognised as a legitimate way of dealing with them. They preferred certified industrial schools or poor law barrack schools, grouped cottages, scattered cottages, boarding out and emigration. In 1910, there was public concern about the harsh treatment of boys in a nautical reformatory. It was alleged that sick boys were caned as malingerers, that others were drenched in cold water as punishment or kept standing all night for trivial offences, and that several boys had died as a result of punishments. The chief inspector of the time was removed from that office, and a whitewashing report produced by a Home Office Under Secretary of State. The press and public were not placated, and a departmental committee on reformatory and industrial schools set up. Charles Russell, a member of that committee, was then appointed as Chief Inspector in the Home Office Children's Department, the department that was to supervise approved schools, remand homes, probation homes, and voluntary homes. Unhappily, Russell died after only 4 years in the post and was succeeded by Dr. Arthur Norris. Norris was born in 1875, the son of a clergyman, and on leaving his boarding school, he trained as a doctor and went to work in Manchester, where he met Charles Russell in the Boys' Club movement. After Russell's death in 1917, Norris was called back from the army in France, and 6 months later, he told a reformatory union meeting that the ideal objective was to make the child's home fit for the child, and to give the child sufficient strength of character to return to his home, even if it was not all that could be desired. He also believed that children from homes and certified schools should not be introduced to luxuries that they would not subsequently get in their own homes. During the First World War, there was in this country a marked increase in the number of illegitimate children born, and this, with the subsequent Spanish influenza epidemic and a decrease in the birth rate amongst the middle classes, led to a demand for children for adoption. Adoption societies sprang up, often with no official guidance or expert help. And by 1920, there was a demand for official machinery to consider whether it was desirable for legal provisions to be made for the adoption of children in this country. By 1926, the Adoption of Children Act came into being, which passed the handling of children from sometimes dubious individuals to recognized adoption societies. In 1927, there were nearly 3,000 children legally adopted. By 1936, that figure had reached over 5,000. Although in 1925 an act was passed which introduced pensions for widows and orphans, the allowances were so small that it was not enough for a mother to support herself and her children. Eleanor Rathbone, one of the great social reformers of the period, fought for sufficient allowances for mothers and widows in particular to enable them to look after their own children at home. She recognized that family ties would be weakened and impaired if there was anything less than complete financial independence. Another important but often neglected aspect of childcare was the psychological and psychiatric treatment of difficult and disturbed children. In 1927, the Jewish Health Organization, with the aid of the London County Council and the Child Guidance Council, founded the first fully established clinic at the Jewish Free School in Spitalfields, and on November the 21st of that year, the first patient attended. Although the problem had been recognized in the late 19th century, it was the Americans who were the first to establish a specialized clinic in this field, designed to develop the psychiatric study of delinquent and difficult children, to develop sound courses of training, and to provide sound methods of treatment. The first British clinic widened these aims to include the parents and teachers, and not just to focus on the problem child. Emigration. A solution for many deprived children in this country was still in operation, Canada, New Zealand and Australia being the principal recipients. In 1924, an official committee looked at the situation in Canada and found that in many cases the children had just become cheap labor. Also, preparation in this country by some agencies and societies was poor. Contact was sketchy after emigration, and government subsidies were seen to be spent in areas non-beneficial to the children. For a significant number of the children, their new life was so unbearable that even to remember it was painful. However, for others, the open air and healthy farm work was a better alternative to the life that had been left behind. Also, as they got older, there was an incentive to work towards a place of their own. Another strand which slowly contributed to a better understanding of children and their needs was a growing interest, from about the 1920s, in the treatment of young offenders. The 1933 Children and Young Persons Act extended the conditions under which they could be brought before a juvenile court as being in need of care or protection or beyond control, and required the court to have special regard to the welfare of the child. The Act also amalgamated industrial schools and reformatories into schools approved by the Secretary of State. Voluntary children's homes also were required to send annual returns to the Home Office and be the subject of inspections. This started the enlightened work of the Home Office Children's Inspectorate in raising standards by visits, consultation and advice. During this period, general improvements in health and education had the effect of improving the lot of children in statutory and voluntary care. But even with these improvements, life in the crowded cottage homes, barrack schools and large children's homes left little scope for the development of individual talents and interests. Staff and children alike became accustomed to order enforced by regimentation. The larger the institution, the more difficult it was to introduce ideas of play, freedom and individuality, because staff and committee members saw nothing wrong with a tidy and orderly regime. Charitable institutions also had to consider their public image if financial contributions were to keep coming in. The question, how many children can we afford to care for properly, was rarely asked. It was during the Depression years of the 30s that family poverty, unemployment, poor health and bad housing all contributed to a climate of misunderstanding and neglect. Because poverty was regarded as a moral weakness caused by fecklessness, drinking, gambling, It was assumed that poor people made bad parents. The emphasis therefore continued to be on the removal of children from bad homes. Indeed, there was practically no concept of working to strengthen family bonds or enabling poor parents to care for their children. Childcare in the 1930s was described by a former Home Office inspector as failing to see the child as an individual with a past, present and future. In residential homes, both statutory and voluntary, staff were found to be treating the children as lower orders who did not deserve the ordinary standards of civilized living. In one home, the windows lacked curtains for fear that the children would wipe their noses on them. They were not provided with handkerchiefs. In an Anglican convent home, menstruation was not to be mentioned, and the girls were given nothing to cope with it, so they tore strips off their sheets and face towels. Staff tended to have their meals separately from the children. The children had no clothes of their own, and were often assembled in height order, and then marched to a counter where they were to receive the next day's garments. Children in residential nurseries might never see a raw potato, only a white mash that appeared on their plates. And some had never been out after dark and seen the stars. In one training school, boys were identified by number, not their names. Some homes had a large bath with a loop of rope hanging over the water, and the boys were put through the water every night, one after the other, all in the same water. The experience of a home life were denied these children, but as far back as 1908, Dr. Barnado's annual report had stated,
Home life is infinitely better than life in an institution. Many of our children we cannot board out for a variety of reasons. We wish we could board them all out. I am convinced that the chief drawback of life in institutions of all kinds is not the monotony of the children's lives, nor the lack of initiative and individuality, but the absence of that most powerful agent in the development of a young child's life, a mother's love. It is this factor which boarding out goes so far to supply.
In 1911, the principle of a minimum age below which a child may not be boarded out was withdrawn, and the establishment of boarding out committees, where women would make up at least 1/3 of its members, was instituted. Local government boards encouraged these committees, called for the first time children's committees, with women employees taking over from the poor law relieving officers the supervision of children in foster homes, both those in public care and those placed privately. In those days, there was little difficulty in finding suitable foster homes, and this in itself contributed to satisfactory standards in the majority of cases, though little is known about the extent or causes of breakdowns or the degrees of happiness. It seems that more children could have been satisfactorily boarded out, and thus more brothers and sisters kept together. However, often when boarding out was suggested, committees and staff at residential homes were suspicious of foster parents' motives. When a placement had been made, it was not the normal practice for the foster parents to meet the child beforehand, so the child would be taken to a strange home by a travelling matron and left there. At the age of 13 or 14, a child would be recalled to the voluntary or local authority home for domestic and industrial training, often causing immense heartache to both child and foster parents. In an era when policies were becoming more enlightened and sophisticated, both in Barnado's and elsewhere, it was still not recognized that good administrative structures were ineffective without carefully selected, well-trained and adequately supported staff. For instance, it's hard to see how house mothers, who could be responsible for up to 25 girls, could have responded to each one's individual emotional needs. There are scant references in the writings of the period as to the quality of residential staff, the effect of low staff-child ratios, how they coped, what were their conditions of service, and what were their relations with the children. Recognizing a need for trained staff, the founder of the National Children's Home, Dr. Stevenson, initiated a scheme to teach and instruct the home's workers in the 1870s. It was also the National Children's Home that set up the first residential childcare training college in Britain in 1933. Barnado's followed with a training school in 1941. And the curriculum included child welfare, hygiene, first aid, home nursing, Bible study, children's games, hobbies and storytelling, cooking and mending, account keeping, general household management, and keep fit. The outbreak of war in 1939 meant that many families were broken up, with both men and women joining the armed services, women taking on war work, and children being evacuated out of the large cities to the relative safety of the countryside. The war meant a great upheaval to the childcare agencies. Thousands of children were moved from homes in the south to castles, baronial halls, and manor houses in areas considered less dangerous. A member of the staff in one of these evacuation homes wrote, "There is much to do settling the children as safely as possible at nights under bedsteads, desks and tables. The rooms are a queer sight, but the children sleep beautifully and know nothing of any danger." In some cases, trench and cellar shelters were provided in those homes that remained in or near the large conurbations. Out of the experience of evacuation came the study by Professor Titmuss, who found that those children who stayed with their families in the urban centres suffered less emotional damage than those separated by the evacuation programme. The study had much to say about the inadequacies of local authorities in coping with the evacuation, and also the physical and emotional care required by children from low-income families in large cities. In January 1945, 13-year-old Dennis O'Neill died in his foster home. With his younger brothers and sister, Dennis had been removed from his parents' home by an NSPCC inspector in 1939 and entrusted to local authority care. The children were deemed to be in need of care or protection, and in 1944, Dennis came to Bank Farm, Minsterley, near Shrewsbury. Cruelty and neglect led to his death, and the knowledge that a child who had been removed from a bad home could experience even more suffering in public care caused widespread concern. Before the O'Neill case, Lady Allen of Hurtwood had issued a pamphlet entitled "Whose Children?", which highlighted the plight of deprived children and called for reform. The death of Dennis O'Neill was a dreadful confirmation of Lady Allen's findings, and the Attlee government set up a committee of inquiry under Miss Myra Curtis. The committee reported in 1946. They found that the substitute care services for deprived children were too complicated and bureaucratic. In all, 3 departments, health, education and public assistance, could be involved in a child removed from his own home. Children were maintained in public assistance institutions whose conditions resembled those of the old poor law workhouses. Sometimes workhouses were used as dumping grounds for children who were cared for by senile men and women or mentally handicapped inmates. Institutional homes provided by the voluntary and statutory services also came under attack in this report. Though most of these homes were said to have sufficient material comforts, the quality of care offered to the children by hard-pressed and inadequately trained staff did not meet the basic needs of the children to feel loved and wanted. The Curtis report received much publicity, both supportive and critical, and its findings led to the Children Act of 1948, which called for a unified system of childcare under a single local government department. Workhouses, like this one, those most potent memorials to the horrors of a bygone age, were finally closed down. And the Children Act of 1948 had at last seen to the demise of the poor law, and all its social and moral implications were thought to have been finally buried.